Well, good morning. It's good to be with you all this morning. I think this is the first time I've ever stopped in this part of Ohio, and I've been looking forward to it. I've known Andy and Melina for about 25 years. I think it's been about 25 years. Chastity was a baby. We were in Kentucky at the same time. We were going through preacher training at the same time and spent a year together doing that and have kind of connected through the years since then. So I've been preaching for 23 years full-time, and it's been a blessing to do that. Several of you have come up and introduced yourselves, and you've seen some of the other work that I've done, creating Bible class study guides and videos and things like that, and I'm grateful to hear that those have been a blessing to you. I do want to say, if there's anything that you hear me say this morning during the course of the lesson that you have questions about, please let me know. You'll be my friend to come up and share that with me. We want to make sure that everything that we say through the course of the lesson comes straight out of God's Word, that His Word comes to make sense to you, and that you're able to apply it. Thank you for how friendly you've been. You've been just so welcoming to me and the guys that I'm taking to the camp up in New York this week. What we're going to do is we're going to spend time over in Daniel chapter 3. I know Andy read from 3 verses 16 through 18, so let's go back to that text. I'm assuming most of us are very familiar with the chapter. I'm going to summarize it. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to summarize it and then focus on two sections in there. I'm going to focus on the confession that the boys make in verses 16 through 18, and then we're going to look at Nebuchadnezzar's observation of their deliverance in verse 28. And the majority of our points this morning are going to come from verse 28 and maybe one or two from verse 29. So when you look at Daniel and you look at these young men, you start thinking through their circumstances. What's the context for this chapter, this fiery furnace? And the context is full of trial. And even though we hopefully never have to go through this kind of trial where you're facing being thrown into an oven, we were joking around about that during the trip, we all face trials of various kinds. Some of the trials that we face are a result of sinful choices that we've made, and they're the consequences that come from those choices. Sometimes we face trials, and they're a result of living in a broken world. Someone gets sick or someone passes away unexpectedly. And then sometimes it's just a confusing mess of the two, where I go through something that's hard and puts pressure on me, and I don't respond to it in a faithful way, and it just compounds the mess. And so when we talk about someone going through a trial, it's helpful to sort through what's the original source of this. Is this a direct result of poor decisions? Is it a result of innocent suffering? Or is it a combination of the two? For these boys, the setting is innocent suffering. They did not choose to go through the exile. They did not choose for Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon to come in and attack Israel, defeat Jerusalem, and cart them away. Like, they did not choose that. Even though they had been warned, the generations ahead of them chose that. And so they were captives of a conquering empire. They had endured the indignity of being made eunuchs. They were forced to endure attacks on their identity as Israelites. In the first chapter, Nebuchadnezzar puts all of these captives through the process of renaming them. He takes away their Israelite names that are associated with Jehovah, and he gives them names that are associated with the Babylonian gods and goddesses. And you think about that indignity, you've got one of the young men who is named after a female deity. Their lives were constantly under the threat of the king. If they didn't perform, he's going to kill them. Tell me my dream, or I'm going to kill you. Give me the interpretation, or I'm going to kill you. Like, that's the setting that they're in. They're trying to be culturally assimilated. They're being taught the Babylonian tongue. And then here, in Daniel chapter 3, you have this, it's basically a political incident, where Nebuchadnezzar is trying to unify the kingdom in acknowledging who he is. And so he invites all of these higher-ups in his government to come to the plains of Dura. And the plain of Dura is kind of like a bowl. You have these hills that form the ridges, and the plain is down below. And in the center of that bowl, he builds a 90-foot tall statue. And when you look at the dimensions of it, it's about 90 feet tall and 10 feet wide. So just think for a second. Either this is like the skinniest human statue ever, 10 feet wide, 90 feet tall, like an elongated man, or it was more like the Washington Monument, where you have a pillar, and at the top of the pillar you have a human figure. And I'm okay with either. I think the second one makes more sense. But the whole thing is then covered in gold. And imagine what that must have looked like when you came over the top of the hills and looked down into this bowl and saw a nearly 100-foot tall, gleaming golden pillar with a guy on top. It would have caught everyone's attention. And then Nebuchadnezzar gives the command. He picks a day where he brings everybody together. And the text is so repetitive in verses 1 through 7. When you hear the music, and he lists off all these instruments. When you hear the music, by the way, there are these instruments. And when you hear the music, and here are the instruments. And the point is, when you hear the music play, you drop. You go to your knees, and you're paying homage to the one who set it up. And we're going to emphasize that as you go through. If you read Daniel 3 in one sitting, pay attention to some of the themes, because there's some that are really, really repetitive. One of the themes is Nebuchadnezzar set it up, the image that he set up. By the way, he set this up. And the idea is there is a man, not a god, there is a man who set up an image who is not a god. And it's all about idolatry. Okay? So he sets this thing up, and basically at the end of 7, you understand, there is no excuse for anyone in the plane to not know the instruction and not hear the music. You think about the acoustics of a depression or a bowl in the ground. We use half bowls, we use amphitheaters, and the sound carries. So there's nowhere that they're going to be in this plane and not hear the music. And then the music strikes up, and the boys don't bow. And another element that you add to their trial, that you add to their pressure, is that there are people that they are working with that are jealous of them. There are other officials that want their jobs. They're jealous that these captives from Jerusalem have been promoted and promoted and promoted, and so they don't like them, and they're angling for them. And so they come and accuse. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't see them, but these other guys see them, and they're like, oh, we're going to get them in trouble. And so they go to Nebuchadnezzar, and they make 3 big accusations against them. What they end up doing, they do not refer to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They do not refer to them by their official titles, which is a sign of disrespect. Instead, they're identified as those captives, which is a slur against them, right? And then what they say is they accuse them of, they don't pay attention to you. King, they don't pay attention to you. That's not true. They pay really good attention to Nebuchadnezzar, or else they would not have been promoted to the degree they were promoted. But they slander them and say they don't pay attention to you. The second thing they say is they don't serve your gods. That's true. They don't serve Nebuchadnezzar's gods. The third thing is they don't worship the image that you've set up. That's true. But not for the reasons that they think. And when Nebuchadnezzar hears that, he holds a trial. He brings the boys forward. And he did not have to give them this trial. He did not have to give them a second chance. He could have just pitched them into the furnace. But because he likes the boys, he says, guys, explain this to me. Like, was there just wax in your ears? Did you not hear the music that I said would be playing all over? Like, if you need me to play it again, I'll do it. Strike it up. Like, he offers to do it again. And that's when you get to the boys in verses 16 through 18. Although before he says strike it up, Nebuchadnezzar issues a threat. Like, if you don't do this, you are going into the furnace. And who is the God, at the end of verse 15? Who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? So he threatens them. And then you get to verses 16 through 18, where these boys, faced with the pain of death, say, look, Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this manner. So, really quick, they are not being disrespectful. They are not being flippant. They're not being ugly. They're not being sarcastic. They're just saying, we don't need time to think about this because our minds are already made up. Like, I don't need to phone a friend. I don't need an extra 10 minutes. We don't need to debate this back and forth. We don't need a compromise. We have made up our mind already. If this be so, in verse 17, if this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us. So the challenge from the king is, who is the God that can deliver you? And they said, Jehovah. Our God is able. And that's such a beautiful phrase. You know, I've been at VBSs and I've been at summer camps, and they've made that phrase the theme for the week. Our God is able. And they'll start with this one, or they'll make this one the pinnacle of the week. And then they'll look at other biblical examples of God demonstrating his ability and his power and his might. Right? Our God is, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, I love verse 18, because it demonstrates a humility on their part. You know, you think about two boys in a sandbox at a playground, and they start playing the, my dad's bigger than your dad, and well, my dad could beat up your dad. Well, my dad's faster than your dad. Well, my dad, and they keep going back and forth. Well, my dad could, he just doesn't want to right now. What the boys are doing here is actually super, super humble, because they're saying God is able to, but I don't know what God's plan is. So even if he doesn't, it doesn't mean he's not God. It doesn't mean he's not powerful. It just means I don't know what God's sovereign plan is right now. And I'm not going to presume to obligate him to a certain path. That's pretty wise in the middle of being threatened with your life. They've thought through this before. I mean, there's no way that you can say something this profound in an instant for the first time. You think about the life that they have lived up to this point. They have wrestled with this before. And so they're saying, look, God, he's able. And I'm pretty confident he will. But even if he doesn't, be it known, we are not going to bow down to your image. We're not going to do it. And so you know how the story goes. The king gets so angry. In verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. My siblings and I always used to joke around about that. When we were younger, we heard someone make a really silly statement like, he was filled with the wrath of furious fury. Like, how many times can you use fury in one sentence to describe somebody? But that's what Daniel is doing here as he records this. Like, Nebuchadnezzar was over the top, irrationally angry. As far as we know, out of everyone that was there that day, 3 men didn't bow. And he was more bent out of shape over those 3 than all of the rest who actually did. And just for a second, there was a buddy of mine, I was listening to him teach through this, and I just thought, you know, that's brilliant. If you were in that moment, and you're in the plane, if you're with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the music strikes up, and everyone starts bowing, visually, what does that look like? You're in a sea of people. Imagine being at a concert or a main floor event or a sporting event where everyone's clapping and cheering, and all of a sudden people start to sit. And you've got 3 people. This is really awkward. Like, you stand out like sore thumbs. And what is the pressure that you feel from everybody in the room? I just kind of want to bow. What if, this is my buddy's point, he's like, they could have found several excuses to bow. They could have looked around, okay, we're bowing, time this just right. A penny! And you've gone through the posture, and you could tell your buddies, oh, I wasn't bowing to the image, I was picking up a penny. Or, my shoe, give me just a second, that gets me lower. Time my shoe, and you get back up. Like, they could have found some kind of, logical loophole that justified putting their body in the right posture and said, but I didn't, my heart really didn't. But they understood it wasn't about that. part of what was going on that day was what they were communicating to everybody else. And they were not going to compromise and lead other people to believe something that wasn't true. They had to stand there against all of the peer pressure around them. And I'm sure there were whispers going, look at those guys, they're not bound. What is going on with those guys? But they didn't compromise. So Nebuchadnezzar is like, I've got to make an example out of these guys, because other people will copy them. So they superheat the oven, and this is more than likely one of those furnaces that was used in the construction of the idol and the melting of the gold. So they used what was available. And they superheated it to the point that when they first opened it, the heat blast killed the guards that opened the door. So the men died on the outside of the oven. And then they bind them, pitch them in, and after a period of time, Nebuchadnezzar is like, wait. Like, I'm not super good at math. I've got guys for that. But how many did we pitch in? 3? I see 4. And so they pull them out, and they only pull out 3. But you know how smoke and fire works, because you've probably been camping or around a campfire or made s'mores or done whatever, and you come back and you smell like a forest fire, because the smoke permeates your clothes and it permeates your hair and it permeates your skin. Like, you smell like a camp for days. And these guys come out and their clothing is not singed, their hair is not singed, they're unbound, and they don't smell. That's how thoroughly they were protected and kept safe. And it blows Nebuchadnezzar's mind, because he had issued a challenge. What God can deliver you out of my hand? And they said, our God is able to deliver. And we're going to talk about that word, deliver. That's a significant word. And then when you get to the end, Nebuchadnezzar issues this proclamation, no God can deliver like the Most High. Okay? That's the summary. But now let's make some observations about this. Starting with verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants. There's that word, delivered. And that first half of the sentence is describing what God did. But I want to focus on what Nebuchadnezzar understood the boys did. Because what they did is they trusted in him. And they set aside the king's command. And they yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. So let's go through and make a couple of points. We've got our passage up there. Let's start with that first phrase, who trusted in him. If you're going to trust God through the fire of your trial, you need to trust that God is good and that God is in control. That God is good and God is in control. How did I get such a really big point off of they trusted in him? I actually got it off the phrase, and I got it off of the word delivered, because that is an important, significant word in the Old Testament. And you start thinking through, well, why is the word deliver so important? Because what Nebuchadnezzar didn't understand is when he issued the challenge, what God is able to deliver you out of my hand, all of a sudden that word triggered all kinds of memories for these Hebrew boys about God and what God does. So going back to Exodus chapter 6 and verse 6, God makes this promise. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery. Isn't that the whole point of the book of Exodus? God delivers. God is a deliverer. Later, Moses, before he finishes his decades of service, in Deuteronomy 4:34, reminds Israel of God's deliverance. Has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation by trials, signs, wonders, and by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you? And he's talking about God's deliverance of them out of Egypt. The word was used in Judges. In Judges chapter 18 and verse 28, you think about how cyclical Judges is. It's not just cyclical, it's like something circling the drain going down. It just is. Like you see a cycle, but it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And the way the book ends, the way the book of Judges ends, is everyone did what was right in their own eyes because there was no king in Israel. That's how the book concludes. But earlier in the book, one of the elements of that in Judges 18:28 is there was no deliverer. The people kept crying out to God, we need a deliverer. Where's the deliverer? And God kept raising up judges to be some kind of deliverer, but they were never the ultimate deliverer. Right? And then you have Psalms. All of these different Psalms that use the word deliver to remember the Exodus or remember what God has done. Or in the Ten Commandments. Do you know how the Ten Commandments start? Before the very first one? In Exodus 20 and verse 2, God reminds them, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Since I'm the one who brought you out, since I'm the one who delivered you, remember that, now here are your laws. So when Nebuchadnezzar did not know what he was doing, he issued a challenge, but he used a word that reminded them, oh, wait a minute, God's our deliverer. He delivered in Exodus, and he delivered in Judges. He's going to deliver in all these other ways. We've been singing these psalms of deliverance that David and his men wrote for temple worship. Like, God's our deliverer. And in all of those instances of deliverance, what God demonstrated was he was good and he was in control. Someone summarized God's deliverance this way. When God delivers, it's God entering into the historical situation of his people and delivering them from bondage. Isn't that what the Exodus was? Where you have the oppression of Pharaoh, things are hard, work gets harder, and the people cry out, and God says to Moses, I have heard their cry, and then he steps in and delivers them. Or through the book of the Judges, as they go through this downward spiral of cycles, that you get this cycle where they're being disciplined, life is rough, people are oppressing them, they cry out to God, he steps in, sends a deliverer. Right? So when God delivers, what you have is God stepping in and intervening. And isn't that what Pharaoh is challenging? Who's going to stop me? And they say, our God's able to, because he is a deliverer. He may not, and if he doesn't, he's got his reason for it. But if anyone can or will, it's our God. Right? So what they did is they trusted that God was good and that God was in control. Go back to Daniel 3:28. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command, his command. They set it aside. Do you remember, he verified, did you guys not hear? Did you not hear the instruction? Let me remind you, this is what the instruction was. And it was very apparent. They knew, and they heard. But they set it aside. I'm going to read a series of parallel Bibles. The ESV says they set aside the king's command. The NLT says they defied the king's command. They heard it, but chose to break it. The King James Version says they have changed the king's word. The New King James Version says they have frustrated the king's word. Another Bible says they violated. Violated means they went beyond, like they knew what it was, and they just blew right past it. And the idea is their decision was intentional. It wasn't an accident. They heard the command, they heard the music, and they chose not to obey. Why would they do that? And I would suggest instead of trusting in the king's command, they trusted in God's command. They compared. It's kind of like a set of scales, where on one side, this is what they heard. This is the text from Daniel 3, verse 5. When you hear every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image. Those three words are really important. Fall down, worship, and image. That's the language Nebuchadnezzar uses. So they've heard that, and they set that on one side of the scales. But what they know from being Israelites and worshiping Jehovah is they know passages like Exodus 20 with the rest of the Ten Commandments. Because in Exodus 20, you have God who said, you shall not make for yourself a carved image. There's that image word. You shall not do that. And you shall not bow down or serve them. So they take that knowledge and set it on the other side of the scales. And they're like, okay, this is what Nebuchadnezzar says, and this is what Jehovah says, and I've got to make a choice because they are diametrically opposed to each other. I can't keep both. And so what they chose was God's was more important and weighty. And so they set the king's instruction to the side and said, I can't do that. So what they did is they trusted what God had to say instead of what Nebuchadnezzar threatened. Does that make sense? How do we apply that as we go through trials, as we face fire, maybe storms? Is a way to say that. I'm going through a storm in my life. I need to think through, what has God said? What has God said about me and my life and difficulty and hardship and possibly responsibility if I have any responsibility in this part? What has God said? And there's so many passages that speak to trial. I brainstormed with some friends just yesterday afternoon about some of these passages. You know, what are some of the words of God that you lean on and trust in when you go through trials? You can go to James 1, count it all joy when you face various trials or trials of various kinds, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. So there's value in your trial, right? You can go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. You've not been tempted beyond your ability to bear it. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability to bear it. And there's more to that verse. There are 4 important promises in that verse. Or what about Romans 8, 28 and 29? You can go to Romans 8, 28 and 29, where God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And verse 29 talks about that purpose is to make us conform to the image of Jesus. That's the good that he's accomplishing in our lives. Those are not Band-Aid verses that you just stick on when things get hard, but they're deep and meaningful promises that we lean on when things get hard. Right? And there are more. And what we need is we need to familiarize ourselves with the words and the promises of God. And just like these boys, when I hear different ideas or competing ideas, I'm going to lean and trust in what God has to say about my situation. I'm going to trust in the word of the Lord. Going back to Daniel 3:28. They trusted in him, they set aside the king's command, and they yielded up their bodies. They yielded up their bodies. I'm really glad that I haven't had to do that yet. I have not faced a burning fiery furnace that's been superheated. I have not had to do that. But you think about what they're willing to do, and how would you summarize that? And you go back to their declaration of faith before the oven gets superheated. You know, even if God doesn't, we are not going to bow down. And this is what they knew. What they knew was, if God doesn't intervene, there's a really hot place right there that this physical body is going to get chucked into. And they chose that. None of them had experienced that before, but they said, it is better for us to endure that than to be disloyal to a good and sovereign Jehovah. And as uncertain as they were, they wanted God to do one thing, but they didn't know if he would. They didn't know what God would do. They trusted themselves to God. They trusted the uncertainty of the next few minutes to God. And the way that we might say that is this. They trusted God with the next few minutes. They trusted God with their future. Because they didn't know. It was unknown to them. I mean, as you're going through trials or you're going through hard things, there are unknowns about it. I mean, if the trial that you're going through is a medical situation, you don't know how long that medical situation is going to last. You don't know what the outcome of the medical situation may be. You may know what your desired outcome is, but you don't know what's going to happen. You have your hope. You know, maybe the trial that you're going through is connected to a loved one or a child, a free will person that gets to make choices independent of you. And you may have a hope and a desire, but you don't know what they're going to end up choosing at the end of the day, because they're not a robot that you can program with a button you can push to get the right. The future is unknown. And what we have to choose is, I'm going to trust God with my future. That's what I'm going to do. You know, there's this silly thing, but it stuck with me for decades. Right? When I graduated high school in 1990, loud colors were so in. They were so in. And my uncle, bless his heart, he's passed away now, but he was just one of those guys that loved to be loud and silly and crazy. And so he bought me this t-shirt. And it was this loud yellow t-shirt. And it had big, bold, contrasting geographic shapes on it. It was so ugly. But I wore it till it fell apart. I was in my 30s before I threw that thing away. Right? And the text that was superimposed on the really loud graphics, on the really loud color, I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. Isn't that what these boys are saying? I don't know what the next 10 minutes are going to be for me. I don't know. It could be this, it could be that. I don't know. But what I do know is I have a good and sovereign God, and He knows. And so I'm going to trust Him with what may happen to me. And I'm just going to trust Him. Right? When you're going through your trial, when you're going through your difficulty, choose to trust God with the unknown of your future. Do you know what we call that biblically? Faith. We call that faith. Faith is not being able to see. And I have a gap of knowledge because I'm not God. But since I'm not, I'm going to trust the one who can see and who has knowledge, and I'm going to trust, that's faith, trust Him. Right? What they ended up doing was letting their faith in God lead them into the future. You think about all the people in Hebrews 11 and all the people, they tie back to Genesis. All these people who went into unknowns, what they're doing is they're trusting God with their futures. Abraham and his family, as they set out, they don't know where they're going, but they know God, and they trust God with their future. The Israelites going into Canaan, and that generation had never been there before in the book of Joshua, and God's like, I'm going ahead of you, just follow me. They're going into the unknown, but they're trusting God. Right? That's talking about our faith. Let's make one more point from this phrase. It's going to seem really silly, but I think it needs to be said, and I think it's something that needs to be said. I'm not trying to be condescending. I'm not. But I think my younger brothers and sisters need to hear this. And that group gets bigger the older I get. All right? They yielded up their bodies. Guess what? That's hard. I'm so grateful we live in America. So grateful. I don't think our country is perfect. It has never been. It will never be. But we have so many blessings here. And you might not realize that until you travel to someplace other than here. You know, the brother that's making plans to go to Africa, who's been to Africa before. I've been to Africa a couple different times. And I've been to Europe, and I've been to the Bible lands, and I've been to all these other places. I've been to Asia. Look, we are so blessed. And I'm not trying to be condescending, and I'm not trying to be rude. But there are some people, you don't know what hard is. And that's a blessing, right? But when our faith calls us to do something hard, do it. Don't say, well, that's hard, and like take a step back. Don't do that. Acknowledge that it's hard. There's never a time where Paul says, well, that's not hard. He doesn't say that. And everyone's hard is different. Your hard is different from my hard. It's not a competition. But as you serve Jesus, as you follow Jesus and love God, God is going to call you as a disciple to do some hard things. He's going to call you to sacrifice, and it's going to hurt. But it's worth doing. Because he's God. And at the end of the day, anything that you end up sacrificing here, even to the point of giving your life, if that's what it's called for, is worth it for the reward that you'll get later. What Paul says over in 2 Corinthians is this light, momentary affliction is working for us an eternal weight of glory. That's another one of those passages that we need to lean on as we go through hard things. Right? So we need to be doing what these boys do. Let's start wrapping up. As I start wrapping up, let's go ahead and switch this over to the songs. Because that's the last slide. I actually taught this yesterday. There's a gentleman down in Florida who put on an online lecture series Thursday through Saturday, and he asked me to teach this lesson. So for an hour yesterday, I was online with about 20 people, and it was more of a Bible study format, and we were rushing through Daniel 3. And there were all of these people that shared, this is the trial I'm facing. Sometimes it was medical. This is the trial that I'm facing. Sometimes it had to do with their family. This is the trial that I'm facing. Sometimes it had to do with death. I mean, one of the reasons that my buddy asked me to speak on this topic, it was the practical Christianity section, I shared with one of you this morning. You know, I'm the father of 6 kids. Oldest is 19. Youngest is about to turn 5 next week. Sons 2 and 3 passed away when they were 6 and 11. Special needs sons. Sick and broken bodies their whole lives. Passed away in 2013 and 2016. And so depending on who I'm talking to, and they say, well, Jeremy, how many kids do you have? It depends on how long of a conversation I want to have. I'll say I have 4 at home. Which they don't blink at that if they don't know me, because they're like, oh, well, maybe they're off doing... No, I've got 4 that are at home, right? If I want to have a conversation, I'll say, you know, I have 6, but 2 have passed. And then you get the, oh, I didn't know. Well, let's talk about that, right? But that's a trial. That's a trial. I don't know what trial you're facing. We're all going to face them. And we're going to face trials multiple times. And the trial that Daniel's friends faced was of their faith. Their faith was being tested and assaulted. My faith has not been tested to that point in that way. But whatever your trial is, the only answer is to handle it the way those boys handle it. And you are not going to come out of that trial the way that God wants you to come out of that trial unless you lean on him. What Paul says in Romans 8:28, and when it says that he's working all things for our good, is that he's making disciples more like Jesus. But if you choose not to be a disciple, trials will break you. If you don't have God helping you, it's going to mess you up. Until you put God back in the picture and lean on him and become a disciple of Jesus, your trials, they will be unbearable without God. They just will be. And by God's design, maybe he's allowing you to go through a trial. I had this conversation with somebody just this last week. Maybe God's allowing you to go through this trial right now to teach you that you need to lean on him. He's letting you go through something hard that you cannot handle on your own so that you can acknowledge that and find his help. I'm not sure where you're at. If you're not a believer in God or a follower of Jesus yet, let's fix that. And if you are a Christian, then lean on him more. And this is the closing point. Look at verse 29. the conclusion of Daniel 3, therefore, Nebuchadnezzar says, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. There is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. And then back in verse 26, he talks about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. That title for God is used, if I remember right, 11 times in the book of Daniel. This is the first time. So Nebuchadnezzar, as he watches these boys go through what they're going through, this isn't necessarily their purpose or their aim, but this is the effect. They are evangelizing for God Most High. Nebuchadnezzar learns something by watching them go through their trial. And then he proclaims a proclamation and sends it out to the entire kingdom. And if you're not familiar with Daniel, Daniel is written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. Aramaic was the common language of the Babylonian Empire, and this is one of those chapters that was written in Aramaic. That means this proclamation was written in a language for the entire empire that they would hear something about God. People are going to learn something about God from you as they watch you go through what you're going through. What is your life saying about God Most High? Are people going to come to know him better and love him more as they watch you? If you're a Christian, I hope they will. And you're not going to do it perfectly. You're not going to do it consistently. And so when you realize that, acknowledge it and come back around and do it better. Right? However we can help you this morning, whether it's by becoming a Christian or you're struggling in your faith and you're struggling doing this well and you just need prayers and encouragement, we'd like to serve you with either of those things. Let us know while we stand and while we sing.